Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to be looking at the issue of the psychology of identity. And so we're going to be picking up where we left off in terms of a number of topics and a number of people. And we're going to carry on from there. We're going to be first looking at why it's important to put history on trial and why we are looking at this from the vantage point of psychology. And so we are integrating some legal dynamics with psychological dynamics, and we are using those together to do an examination of history. And so we are putting history on trial, and we're going to be looking at some evidence and some facts and seeing if we can come to a better understanding of what the facts actually are and how those facts may lead to an increase in understanding what is true and what is not true. And as always, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now, we don't have as much time as we used to have in the community classroom in this particular space, so we have to be very picky and choosy about what we are addressing and what we are exploring and examining. So we're going to start off looking at why it's important to put history on trial before we jump into what's going on in terms of Scotland's history and how Scotland's history relates to you. And so one of the reasons why history needs to be on trial is because history is basically stories. And so you have this dynamic of prehistory where you have history that was not written down in a conventional sense. And so you have those oral narratives, and some of those oral narratives or those oral traditions, they clash with written history. And they also clash with other narratives. And so there are competing historical narratives between different groups of people, and even sometimes within the same cultural group of people. You also have a dynamic going on where you have diverse agendas. And so you have individuals historically providing historical narratives, and they are coming from different vantage points because they have different agendas, and sometimes those agendas are not in support of the truth. And so sometimes the agendas are in support of the truth as much as they can be, and then sometimes the agendas are serving to manipulate the truth or adulterate the truth. The other issue is you have these diverse interpretations of a situation. And so you can have multiple individuals seeing the same thing, and they are going to see it through different lenses. And so they are going to come away from that experience with a different historical narrative. And so it's important to parse all of these different interpretations of what presumably would be the same sets of facts. Another important issue, and this is probably the most important issue, is this issue of migration and exchanges and replacements. And so you have all of these population migrations that have taken place over time. And then you even have population exchanges, and we talked about that before related to Turkey and Greece. But you have some population exchanges that are not done formally. They are done sort of under the table. And so you may not even be aware that they are taking place. And so you have a group of people that start to move in one direction, and slowly but surely the people that are in the land space that the people come to, those people end up dispersing, or in some historical situations, even going on now, you have the people migrating to another place and perhaps even going to the place where the people migrated from. And so you have this unusual exchange going on, and then you have a dynamic where identities get confused. And so you have this population replacement dynamic that takes place sometimes. It's not always clear that it's happening when it's happening, and so people will often migrate for better opportunities or the perception of better opportunities. And then after a while, they don't even remember in terms of their children, grandchildren, they don't remember that they came from someplace else. You also have this dynamic of invasions and colonization, and sometimes the invasions and the colonizations don't take place the way people think they might. Sometimes you have entities that are looking at imperialistic endeavors, and they will send people to different places to settle, if you will, in those places. And then it makes it easier to then take over those places. And so that has happened frequently throughout history. Another dynamic that takes place is adulteration. And so you'll have these situations where you have these migrations, exchanges, replacements, invasions, and the individuals who migrate sometimes take on the identities of the native people, of the natives of that land. And so they take over the identities of those individuals. It's called going native in many instances, and they sort of forget the culture that they had prior to going to that new space. And so they take that on, and they become indistinguishable in terms of the native population and the new population. And so there is this process of acculturation and assimilation. You also have dynamics where you have cultural appropriation or basic identity theft. Because sometimes when you have the migration and the settling, you may have the native population displaced and the new people taking on the identity of the native people and even claiming that identity, claiming that that's their land space, or claiming that they are the natives of that land. And so you've seen this in a number of places, and we can talk about that. But so going native is a big issue because it really muddies the water. You really get confused about who is who and what exactly is going on. And the individuals involved get confused because after a couple of generations, those children do not necessarily know that their ancestors, their grandparents came from somewhere else. And so there is this sense of being native, even though they may not be native. And the other dynamic that takes place is ancestral and cultural amnesia. And this happens when you have all of these migrations and people moving from place to place, not sitting still, and then forgetting who they are. And so when this happens over hundreds, thousands of years, you can imagine it can get very confusing, and people can have a lot of confusion about who they are, who their ancestors are, where they came from, and then you have a lot of mixing that goes on. And so people have, these mixed identities, and sometimes those identities are competing identities, or you've had a situation where one part of an ancestry was a part of the oppression of the other part of the ancestry. And what we're going to do is we're going to quickly look at some dynamics in terms of history and the history of the Western Isles of Scotland. And so we're going to be looking at the Hebrides. We're going to look at some dynamics related to the Isle of Skye, the Isle of Jura, the Isle of Arran, and Bute. And so what we're going to quickly do is we are going to look at some data inside of this book, which is a description of the Western Islands of Scotland. We are going to look at some of the demographic data, and we're going to see that the individuals that are present on the islands in Scotland now are inconsistent with the individuals who are described historically as occupying those land spaces. Now the question comes up, what happened to those people? Were they deported? Were they sent to Australia? Were they sent to the west coast of Africa? Were they sent to the Americas? And if that is the case, they were deported and that is known, why is that not a part of the standard understanding of history? Why is this not discussed, and why is the history of Scotland presented in one way when clearly it's inconsistent with this document that is written for a European monarch? And here you can see in the preface that there's an exploration of the islands and focusing on the Hebrides. And one of the isles focused on in the book is the Isle of Skye. And here you see a general description of the inhabitants of the island. They are described as being well proportioned, free of any bodily imperfections, of a good stature. The color of the hair is commonly light brown, red, or black. And you also see that they are a healthful and strong-bodied people. And here you see a notation that the inhabitants were both musically gifted and physically gifted in terms of being sportsmen and also in terms of playing music. And so some of them were able to play the violin pretty well without ever being taught. Another isle of focus is the Isle of Jura, and it's spelled J-U-R-A-H, and sometimes the H is left off, and so sometimes you'll just see J-U-R-A. Now, this is where history definitely goes on trial, because you see here in notation, the natives were very well proportioned, being generally black of complexion and free from bodily imperfections. They speak the Irish language, they wear the plaid, the bonnet, just like other islanders. This is inconsistent with the demographic narrative that we currently have related to Scotland and the Scottish Isles. The question is why? Why is there a different narrative? You have this set of facts, and then you have other sets of facts, and they are not merging. They don't come together. They don't hang together. And so you either have one is the truth or you have the other is the truth. And the question is, why are we not talking about these competing narratives? It's very important because, again, once you understand the narrative, the history, the truth of one group of people, you better understand the history, narrative, and truth of all people. And so it's important that we have truth about our histories. These are our collective human histories, and they all should hang together in some sort of way. But right now we have histories that are not hanging together, and you have dynamics whereby individuals have apparently disappeared from this land space, and there should be an explanation, just a clear, conventional, clear-cut explanation of what happened to these individuals, because the narrative, again, is that this is not the way that any of the individuals looked. And so you have individuals that were deported out of this space and were sent to places where people also had generally black complexions, if you want to use that term, brown complexions. And so that is very interesting that the places that people were deported to consistently had people of brown complexions. You have Australia, you have those Indian Ocean islands, you have the west coast of Africa people were deported to, and you have the Americas, particularly the islands, the Caribbean islands. And so this is very important, particularly when you listen to a number of individuals from the Caribbean and you can hear that Scottish, Irish, Gaelic accent in their language. You also have the Isle of Bute as an island of focus. And there's also the island of Arran. And here we see yet another notation with this demographic information that is inconsistent with standard history. And you see here the inhabitants of this isle are well proportioned, generally brown, some of them of black complexion. They enjoy a relatively good health status, and they have a genius for all callings of employment. And you see here another notation about the language of the people in the Isles, that they pretty much spoke the Irish language, and then many also spoke English. And you also see a notation here that the natives are all Protestant, and so that's important to also make note of. Here you have a notation about another isle, and it is noted that the inhabitants there are also all Protestant and speaking the Irish tongue. A few of them speak English. They are described as fair or of a brown complexion. This is also an important notation where the natives gave an account to the author that several years before, a vessel brought some rats onto the island. And so this is important because this is also during the time frame of the plague. And so the plague was thought to be spread by rats. And so it's interesting to note that a vessel actually brought rats into that location. And here is another descriptive notation. For this one, it says the inhabitants are well proportioned and seem to be more sanguine. And sanguine is a reddish color, a deep, dark reddish color. Now, this notation here is consistent with history and historical narratives because the understanding is that a number of people left the Isles, they left Europe, coming to the Americas and going to other parts of the world because there would be better opportunities. And you see here that the inhabitants of the Western Isles were in want of employment, and there were about 40,000 of these individuals. And here you see another notation. The natives here are very well proportioned, being generally black of complexion, free from bodily imperfections. They speak the Irish language, and like other islanders, they wear the plaid and the bonnet. You might have noticed that plaid, argyle, tartan has made quite a comeback and is very, very prevalent in terms of material usage this particular year. And here you have an additional notation for this particular island. It says the inhabitants of this isle are generally well proportioned again, and their complexion is for the most part black. There's another notation about the children, and the author indicates that the children go more early than most children. They've observed the children to actually walk at 10 months old, and they are able to apparently withstand a number of dynamics in terms of the environment. And here you see yet another notation related to the inhabitants of one of the isles. They are considered generally well proportioned and of a black complexion, and they speak only the Irish tongue. Now, there are several other notations throughout the book that you might want to take notice of, and some of the notations involve the structure, the political structure on the islands. And so you see a notation here related to the king of that time, and you see that there was a notation about a 7-foot square stone, and that this was the stone that the monarch would be crowned on. And so this was a part of their tradition. There is also a notation going throughout the book about stones, and so a variety of stones, some of them small, some of them large, but there are multiple notations about stones and the importance of stones. Okay, so we have covered history on trial, why history needs to be on trial, and why history needs to be on trial specifically related to Scotland. Scotland has a reach that has spread throughout the world, and the question is why. So you have this departure from this one point going to all of the parts of the world. This is highly unusual, and there should be an explanation for this, a ready explanation for this. There is not, however, a ready explanation for this. There is very little discussion about this dynamic. And so you have the Scottish people being spread out to all of the continents without any historical examination of this on a consistent basis. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the history of Scotland, particularly the Scottish Isles, as you can see, that history has been obscured. And so you have a lot of esoteric dynamics going on where people don't really know what is going on. But the purpose of this series is to put history on trial and to parse all of these facts to see if we can get to a better understanding of the truth. And hopefully a better understanding of the truth will help you to better understand your personal history so that you can have a better understanding of your personal and collective identities. It's important to have a sense of identity. It's important to know who you are and who other people are and who you are in relation to other people. It's also important to keep an open mind about your identity. You have a number of individuals who purport to know all about the history of the world going back thousands of years, but they can't tell you who their third grandparents are. And so it's important for you to keep things in perspective. And if you stay focused on your own ancestry, it'll give you a better sense of the ancestry of others. But with all of the movement that has taken place around the world, it's likely that your ancestry is mixed. And so just keep an open mind about that, because you have these dynamics of, again, people migrating, people going native, all sorts of dynamics going on about identity appropriation, about changing identities. You have all of this cultural and ancestral amnesia going on. And so, again, if you are really trying to get a better understanding of your ancestry, your heritage, that culture, that history, it's important to keep an open mind. Remember, knowledge is power, and we will be following up with the origins of the name Africa.